I guess maybe a good place to start is to talk about why my wife and I moved here with our kids too. We came out from Los Angeles about 3 years ago now. And one of the reasons was because of my art practice, but also because we wanted a better life for our family to get out of LA. And while there were many, many things we loved about it, I think the idea of being able to own a home here in this sort of wonderful community and have our kids be able to walk down the street and just enjoy life here was sort of one of the main attractions. In LA, space is so precious that I was in the garage out back for 7 years building all the sculptures and everything that I do out there. So it was, we came here, we were looking for a space that I could actually build out an actual studio. So we're sitting in the carriage house on the second floor of the, behind our main house. And we're on the corner here of Prospect and Minor in Falls Village. And an artist, Victor Valla, was actually an owner of the home, 2 owners before me as well also. So the house itself sort of has a history of artists being in it, which is sort of, we didn't even know that at the time of purchasing it, but like it was sort of a neat thing. And then Victor Valla actually gave me a drawing he did of the home as well.
How did you find Falls Village?
How do we find Falls Village? We found Falls Village by looking in upstate New York and actually looking all over. We even looked in Detroit. We looked all over the place to figure out exactly where we should be. And to be honest, the taxes for schools were so high in upstate New York. And we had a friend that was from down the street who grew up here, and they were like, you should be looking in Connecticut. And we didn't know anything about Connecticut. And we came here and just sort of took a chance. The house had actually sat empty for about 3 years. This was before COVID, pre-COVID, so the market here wasn't fantastic. And we were really, really fortunate to have found not only the home and the property, but the community. Like, you know, I guess you never know when you go into a place whether or not you're gonna like the people who live next door to you. And we were incredibly lucky to fall into Falls Village because this whole community has been really welcoming, and we've made a lot of really amazing friends. My wife and I talk about this all the time. We feel like we walked into like a little, it sounds so trite, but like a little piece of heaven when we ended up here. So, and I'm fortunate also that my job allows me, on top of being an artist, I have a day job as well too.
Do you?
Yeah, so I am the director of business development for a large art shipping company. There's 11 offices throughout the US and they ship artwork all over the world. So I've been there for 15 years, and the reason I was in LA is because I was running their West Coast operations, and now I'm able to be remote. So I travel a good bit, but also go into the city from here. It's close enough to New York that I can go in every once in a while and do what I need to do.
So you want to tell me about your art?
About the work? Yeah.
About the work itself?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. Whenever I do a studio visit, I'm not always telling the story of where we came from, but honestly the artwork is exactly that. It's telling the story about like where I came from, and not beating you over the head with all of the information. But a lot of, and we'll take a look at this I'm sure, but the objects in the studio, and there are thousands of objects here in the studio, they've been collected over many, many years, and many of them, a majority of them, come from my father-in-law in North Carolina, who's also an artist. I mentioned most of these objects come from my father-in-law, and I'll explain that a little bit. So My father-in-law is an artist as well too, and he's a sculptor. So I was already an artist and a sculptor before I met my wife, but it was interesting. I was down in his studio in North Carolina one day, and he stopped making artwork to raise the two daughters, my wife and her sister. But he still collects objects, like thousands and thousands of objects. Some people might say he's a little bit of a hoarder. But like so I was in the studio one day in North Carolina, and I said to him, I was like, oh my God, that bowl up there on the top shelf, I mean, that's amazing. He goes, do you want that? And I was like, can I take it? This is fantastic. And then I started collecting the objects at the studio, and he loaded me up. And then I made the mistake of saying like, oh, I love this wooden spoon over here. I like this object. And then all of a sudden, the next thing I knew, I had a box of like 400 wooden spoons in the mail that were on my doorstep. So he's sort of living vicariously through me to create objects, but the things that I come up with are totally separate than what often he envisions.
So your sculptures are vertical,
Often, yes.
often
Yeah, they're like totems.
totems. And what inspires you
To use that vertical, I think it's taken, so this is another interesting aspect of being an artist, I think. Everybody walks into the studio and they think you have an intent behind every action. I do believe that a majority of artists walk into a process of creating and they don't understand fully what they're making in the time of making it, but they come to understand it in the years or days or months to come moving forward. So for me, it took me a long time to figure out why I was making vertical sculptures, totems. And the reason is because they're stand-ins for the human figure. So you can see in this one, these, I mean, I'll give away the secrets here, but like, it's not that hard to see. These are bowls. So this is a wooden bowl upside down. These are actually 4 wooden bowls sandwiched between each other. This was, I think, part of a lamp at one point. This object, I don't know, I found a bunch of these. My father-in-law Brent sent me a ton of these. This actually here, this metal thing, this was a wall sconce. So this part was attached to the wall. It was flipped upside down and it had like a candle or a flame that came out of it. I cut this off, and then this and this were attached through the back side. And what I did is retrofitted some of the bolts and stuff that actually went into the back side of this. So one of the things I'll do if I don't have objects that actually work, or I have an idea about something, I'll go and I'll turn this myself on the lathe, or I'll use the wood shop downstairs to create any number one of these objects. So anytime you're looking at these, it's tough to sort of tell what I made and what I didn't make. Oh, these are shower curtain rods. So
what?
Shower curtain rods. Yeah. So you look at these and you're like, God, where did this all, and it just sort of all fits together. So I guess if we want to look at how I'm sort of putting more objects together, this might be a good one. So this was something I was working on, but I'll take it all apart here so you can see. So these are the bits and pieces of something that I was sort of working on. That's how I sort of think about creating objects. Some of these objects, like this thing, has been sitting in my studio for maybe 6 years, 7 years. I've had it for a really long time. It's just a gourd that somebody has taken and drilled holes into. And this actually came out of a thrift store, but I've adapted it. It had different parts on it and I took them off. And I wanted to make it so that it was unique enough on its own that you couldn't quite figure out what it was right on first look unless you've seen these before. So these objects, some of these were new. This one I've only had a year or so, but I've been sitting with it and I thought it was like really beautiful. But one of the problems is I didn't want you to walk into this and think right away, oh, it's a flower, like I get it. So what I did was I started taking some other objects, like here's a wooden bowl. So I placed the bowl over the top, and all of a sudden you have this sort of beautiful base. Like, and where do these shapes and sort of, where does this come from and how does that put together? And then this bowl all of a sudden becomes less recognizable, right? Like, you don't think about it being a bowl sitting on top of another object, you think of this being a singular thing. So then I started putting these together, and this is a good example. This doesn't work for me. I need some transition between objects. So I had a coaster that I placed the coaster in between, and now all of a sudden you have a jump between those objects that gradually moves it up into this vertical space. So the next thing I was doing was I was like, okay, so I've got this sort of a beautiful base. Now many things could go on top of this. So this is where we might depart, and I could put this together and live with it for 2 months and have it work, or I may find out that it doesn't work and I'll just start taking it apart again. But this base to me seems like it's pretty good. So then I take this. This thing was separate, and I don't know what it was used for. I'm sure somebody watching this will be able to tell us, but I was like, God, it's so beautiful and sort of fine. What do I do? So I popped that on top, and I liked it. Now this may need some type of transition here again. Who knows? But then I was like, there has to be something in the center. So I stuck this wooden ball in there. And to hold this in place, I knew the wooden ball, so I used a little bit of wax. I just have a little bit of wax under there to hold it temporarily. Now, if this was going to go together as a finished thing, what will often happen is I'll drill down through most of these objects and I'll put a dowel of some sort up through all of the objects. In the case of this metal thing right here, I wouldn't be able to do that. So probably what I do is I would attach it with some type of epoxy or a heavy duty glue. And then finally, this wasn't finished. So I had that gourd and I set it on top. So it was floating in between here, and this is where that tension we were talking about earlier, you see the tension in the object almost touching the sides, but not quite. And this is floating in the center. So it gives a little bit of tension, and it goes down into this sort of like smooth, sort of beautiful base. It seemed to work for me. And I don't know if this will be a finished object or not, but I've been sitting with it for a few weeks now, and we'll find out. I think one of the other interesting things is, I was talking about looking at objects in new ways and figuring them out. My father-in-law had sent me this, and it's just obviously a little umbrella, and it was broken. But one of the things that happened was, when it came out of the box, it was broken, and it was like this. So that is interesting to me, because that doesn't look like the umbrella. That looks like an object that can be used to create something else. So maybe what I do is I cut the top of this off, and then all of a sudden it becomes something that sits there. I don't want it to look like a lamp though. So I'll have to figure out if other objects get attached to it, if something happens up here. It's just interesting to think about new ways of looking at familiar objects that you always live with. So this is used for yarn, and you can straight it. I don't know how it functions. Once again, I'm sure many people watching this will say, of course. So you spin, it spins, and then you're able to put your yarn into the balls that it needs to be in. But for me, this is the same thing. Like those moments of looking at this, and then look, you have a repeated pattern, right? So this umbrella has the same repeated pattern that's inside of this as well too. So when you start thinking about how are these objects, could they live together? Is this something that who knows, right? But being able, I think one of the unique things, and once you've done this long enough, is being able to see the patterns in objects and how things function and they work. And I think that's what's sort of exciting too, is I just see things, I think, often in a different way than a lot of people see things. It's training your eye to sort of understand it. I wish I had a painting to show you while I was in here too, but...
There's some on your website.
Yes, there's 2 of them on the website you can take a look at. I do paintings now again, and I haven't done them. I just started making them again, I think like I did the first one in 14 years, like 3 years ago, and then I've only made another one in the last like 3 years. So I am painting again in a more productive fashion, but the paintings and the sculptures include a lot of chairs and empty chairs because they sort of embody this idea of sort of a missing figure. This idea that architecture isn't activated and doesn't actually do anything until someone is in the space living in it or walking through it. Like architecture is actively working when someone is in it, right? And when nobody's there, it's sort of like, what's the point? As an artist, when you look at putting a work together, you think about a composition. So the composition is always sort of the first thing you're sort of considering and about how things work together. I get that this may be totally wonky for most people when they're thinking about art or sculpture, but as an artist and thinking about how I interact with things, this is something that I sort of deal with on a daily basis, and I've come to like trust because I see it. You deal with it with design and feng shui all the time too, right? Like if you put a chair in the center of the room, you can't walk through that chair. You have to walk around it. So what's happening is that chair has activated the space in a way that makes you actively forces you to walk around it. It's making you interact with it and not in a good way sometimes. So you have to think about sculpture in the same way. And is it positive or negative how it makes you interact with it? I think that's what's exciting about sculpture.
When you start a sculpture, do you envision what it's going to look like when it's done? You start and just build. I
start and build. I think one of the things that happens is like one of the great things that I figured out about making work and sculpture particularly is the mistakes are often better than the intent. So when I'm in an object and I start picking up objects off of my shelves here and I start looking at things, I'll think that I have an idea of what two pieces are going to go well together, and often it works because I know it really well. But what happens is I'll start building and creating these structures, and you put an object on that you think is going to work and you're just like, it just doesn't feel right. So I can sometimes sit with these objects and I won't glue them together often, and sometimes I do glue them together and I have to cut them apart and start over again. But what will often happen is I balance these objects all on top of each other, so they're all balanced and they're sitting there, and I'll have them on a table and I'll have to sit with it for an hour, a week, maybe a month sometimes before I figure out if it's working or not working.
I don't see very many of your sculptures in here. Is that because they're all on display at exhibits in LA and New York?
I have a limited number of sculptures in here now. I have one here, I've got a few up there. Because they are with collections, I have them out. And before we moved from LA too, I gave a lot away to friends. I did artist trades. So any of the sculptures that I had like sitting in the studio, I traded other artists for artwork. So my house is full of artwork from other artists too. I want all of the objects to be living in the world. Like, I don't want them to be in storage. I don't want them to be sitting, I love living with my own work, but like, I don't need to be sitting with all of these objects. And often one of the things that happens too is you have a thought process of why you're creating these things, and then you move on. So I don't need to be reminded of what I made like 6 years ago. I want to be in the now of creating what I'm going to create in the next 6 years, right? Or the next month. So if I can get rid of the objects and sell them as quick as possible, or if I need to do an artist trade, then I'll do that as well too. But I like to push the art out of the studio and not keep it in all the time.